Securing your Azure environment, proactive tips, and best practices. Hey there, fellow tech enthusiasts. Welcome to our channel, where we dive into the latest and greatest in cloud computing. Today, we're going to talk about something really important: securing your Azure environment. Did you know that over 60% of data breaches are due to poor security configurations in the cloud? In this video, we'll be sharing proactive tips and best practices to help you protect your Azure resources from potential threats. So, let's get started. So why is Azure security so important? Well, for starters, Azure is a massive cloud platform that offers a wide range of services, from virtual machines and storage to databases and artificial intelligence. With great power comes great responsibility, and it's up to us to ensure that our Azure resources are secure and protected from unauthorized access. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, but isn't Azure already secure? And the answer is yes. Azure has a robust security framework in place, with features like encryption, firewalls, and access controls. However, security is a shared responsibility between Microsoft and the customer. That means it's up to us to configure and manage our Azure resources in a way that ensures their security and integrity. In this video, we'll be focusing on the proactive steps you can take to secure your Azure environment. We'll cover topics like identity and access management, network security, data protection, and monitoring and incident response. By the end of this video, you'll have a solid understanding of the best practices and tips to help you protect your Azure resources from potential threats. Let's start with identity and access management. This is a critical aspect of Azure security, as it determines who has access to your resources and what actions they can perform. In Azure, identity and access management is handled through Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD. Azure AD is a comprehensive identity and access management solution that allows you to manage user identities, group memberships, and access permissions. With Azure AD, you can create custom roles, assign permissions, and even integrate with on-premises Active Directory environments. So, what are some best practices for identity and access management in Azure? First, make sure to use multi-factor authentication, or MFA, to add an extra layer of security to your user accounts. You can also use Azure AD Conditional Access to restrict access to sensitive resources based on user and device attributes. Another important aspect of identity and access management is least privilege access. This means granting users only the permissions they need to perform their jobs, and nothing more. You can use Azure AD Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, to assign custom roles and permissions to your users. Finally, make sure to regularly review and update your access permissions to ensure that they're still relevant and necessary. You can use Azure AD Access Reviews to automate this process and ensure that your access permissions are always up to date. Now let's talk about network security. Network security is critical in Azure as it determines how your resources communicate with each other and the outside world. In Azure, network security is handled through virtual networks, or VNets, and network security groups, or NSGs. VNets allow you to create isolated networks in Azure with their own IP address spaces and security configurations. NSGs, on the other hand, allow you to control incoming and outgoing traffic to your VNets. So what are some best practices for network security in Azure? First, make sure to use secure protocols, such as HTTPS and SSH, to encrypt traffic between your resources. You can also use Azure Firewall to restrict incoming and outgoing traffic to your VNets. Another important aspect of network security is segmentation. This means dividing your network into smaller, isolated segments, each with its own security configuration. You can use Azure VNet peering to connect multiple VNets together, while still maintaining isolation and security. Finally, make sure to regularly monitor and update your network security configurations to ensure that they're still relevant and effective. You can use Azure Network Watcher to monitor and troubleshoot your network traffic, and Azure Security Center to identify and remediate potential security threats. Now let's talk about data protection. Data protection is critical in Azure as it determines how your data is stored, processed, and transmitted. In Azure, Data protection is handled through encryption, backups, and access controls. Encryption is a critical aspect of data protection, as it ensures that your data is protected from unauthorized access. In Azure, you can use Azure Storage Encryption to encrypt your data at rest, and Azure Disk Encryption to encrypt your data in transit. Backups are also critical, as they ensure that your data is recoverable in case of a disaster or data loss. In Azure, you can use Azure Backup to create automated backups of your data, and Azure Site Recovery to create disaster recovery plans. Finally, access controls are critical, as they determine who has access to your data and what actions they can perform. In Azure, you can use Azure RBAC to assign custom roles and permissions to your users, and Azure Storage Access Controls to restrict access to sensitive data. What are some best practices for data protection in Azure? First, make sure to use encryption wherever possible, including at rest and in transit. You can also use Azure Key Vault to manage your encryption keys and access controls. Another important aspect of data protection is backups and disaster recovery. Make sure to create automated backups of your data and have a disaster recovery plan in place in case of a disaster or data loss. Finally, make sure to regularly monitor and update your data protection configurations to ensure that they're still relevant and effective. You can use Azure Security Center to identify and remediate potential security threats, and Azure Monitor to monitor and troubleshoot your data protection configurations. Now let's talk about monitoring and incident response. Monitoring and incident response are critical in Azure, as they determine how you detect and respond to potential security threats. In Azure, monitoring and incident response are handled through Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor, and Azure Sentinel. Azure Security Center provides a comprehensive security monitoring and incident response solution with features like threat detection, vulnerability assessment, and incident response. Azure Monitor provides a unified monitoring solution with features like log analytics, metrics, and alerts. Azure Sentinel provides a cloud-native security information and event management, or CM, solution with features like threat detection, incident response, and security orchestration. So what are some best practices for monitoring and incident response in Azure? First, make sure to enable Azure Security Center and Azure Monitor to monitor your Azure resources for potential security threats. You can also use Azure Sentinel to provide a cloud-native CM solution. Another important aspect of monitoring and incident response is incident response planning. Make sure to have an incident response plan in place with clear procedures and protocols for responding to potential security threats. Finally, make sure to regularly review and update your monitoring and incident response configurations to ensure that they're still relevant and effective. You can use Azure Security Center to identify and remediate potential security threats, and Azure Monitor to monitor and troubleshoot your monitoring and incident response configurations. That's it for today's video on securing your Azure environment. We hope you found these proactive tips and best practices helpful in protecting your Azure resources from potential threats. Remember, security is a shared responsibility between Microsoft and the customer, so make sure to take an active role in securing your Azure environment. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on cloud computing and security. See you in the next video, and feel free to leave your own tips or questions about Azure Security in the comments below.